There are certain experiences that once lived through change a person forever. The kind that sit with you long after the guns go silent, long after you've come home. What I'm about to share with you today, it's not easy to hear, but it's important. It's a window into a reality that most of us can only try to imagine, a reality lived by millions on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Grab yourself a coffee, maybe some tea, settle back into your chair because this story, this account, it demands your full attention. It's going to be detailed, it's going to be honest, and it's going to take us deep into one of history's most brutal theaters of war. If you find value in these historical accounts, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories, they need to be told. They need to be remembered. Now, let me take you back to June 1942, to a place called the Volkhov in northwestern Russia. Picture this, endless stretches of dense forest, ground so muddy it could swallow a man whole, and two massive armies locked in a struggle that would define the course of human history. This is where our account begins, with a young German forward observer positioned just feet away from an MG-42 machine gunner, watching, waiting as the Soviet forces prepared another assault. The MG-42, if you've never heard one, it's hard to describe. It didn't sound like other machine guns, It fired so fast, somewhere around 1,200 rounds per minute, that the individual shots just blended together, like fabric tearing. That's what the soldiers called it, a ripping sound that could be heard across the battlefield. And the thing is, this weapon, it almost never jammed. Even in the thick mud of the Volkhov, where everything else seemed to fail, the MG-42 kept firing. So there they were, this observer and this gunner, two men who'd never met before that morning, sharing a few words about enemy movement, nothing more, just doing their jobs, watching the tree line. Then it happened. The Russians came, not slowly, not carefully, but in a surge, moving through that dense brush that separated the two armies. The gunner, he didn't hesitate. He opened up immediately, that distinctive ripping sound cutting through the morning air. The observer, he called back a fire mission, requesting the 75mm guns to drop shells in a curtain about 25 yards in front of their position, as close as he dared. And here is where you start to understand what combat really is. There was no return fire initially, no clearly visible targets, just thick foliage, just the knowledge that somewhere in that green wall, Soviet soldiers were advancing. So they fired anyway. They raked their weapons over the entire field, the observer adding his MP-40 submachine gun to the torrent of bullets pouring from the machine gun. Shells from the heavy guns began slamming down in support. The barrel of the MG-42, it got so hot from the relentless firing that the gunner had to yank it off and toss it into a puddle next to them. Steam erupted from the water as the superheated metal hit the cold liquid. He locked in a fresh barrel, started firing again. The empty shell casings, they were piling up around his feet, a small mountain of brass growing larger with each passing minute. Half an hour passed like this, maybe more. The observer, he had to duck down repeatedly to reload his MP-40, those 32-round magazines emptying faster than you'd think. And it was during one of these reloads, just 15 seconds of vulnerability, that everything changed. He ducked down, started loading a fresh magazine, and the machine gun went silent. At first he thought the gunner was just reloading, switching barrels again. Common enough in a firefight like that. But then he looked to his right. The gunner was crumpled on the ground, blood running from a hole in his temple just under the rim of his helmet. A sniper's bullet, one shot, precise, deadly. The observer hadn't even heard it over the din of combat. And in that moment, a thought flashed through his mind, one of those thoughts that stays with you forever. It could have been him. If his magazine hadn't run out those few seconds earlier, if he hadn't ducked down at that exact moment, it would have been his head in that sniper's crosshairs. There's not much time to think about death in the middle of a battle, you understand. The fight continues whether you're processing what just happened or not. So he did what soldiers do. He kept moving. Crouching low to stay hidden beneath the log fortifications, he sprinted to the next infantry position, 15 yards away, to alert them that they'd lost their machine gun support in that sector. His role as forward observer gave him that latitude of movement, something the regular infantry didn't have. They had to stay, had to hold their positions. He could leave, and so he did, escaping the fate of that unnamed comrade. The Battle of the Volkhov, it finally ended on June 28th, 3.5 months after the German forces had arrived in that sector. The German High Command reported capturing approximately 33,000 Red Army prisoners, 650 artillery pieces, 170 tanks, and 3,000 machine guns. Among those prisoners was General Vlasov, who would later lead units of captured Russian troops fighting alongside Germany. The Soviets considered him a traitor, executed him after the war ended. But here's what the official reports don't tell you: the condition of the German troops who survived. The observer himself, he lost about 20 or 25 pounds during those months, dropped to an emaciated 160 pounds, and he was one of the lucky ones. Many others suffered far worse. When he walked over the battlefield afterward, what he saw, I don't know if I can adequately describe it. Where dense woods had once stood, there was now just a forest of stumps stretching to the horizon. Soviet dead or pieces of them carpeted the churned-up ground. The stench, he said, it was indescribably ghastly. Yet despite this horror, despite this misery, the German troops still believed. Victory at the Volkhov reinforced their faith that Germany would eventually prevail in the east. That summer, a new offensive in southern Russia gave them more hope that final victory wasn't far away. On July 1, 1942, the 58th Infantry Division was transferred northwest to the perimeter of something called the Oranienbaum Kessel, about 15 miles west of their old position. Soviet troops in this area had been cut off during the previous summer's campaign, surrounded in a large pocket with their backs to the Gulf of Finland. The division occupied about 15 miles of front, but compared to the Volkhov, this was almost a rest period. Relative quiet, occasional infiltration attempts by Soviet squads maybe once a week, but nothing like what they'd just endured. It was here, at Oranienbaum, that the observer received the Infantry Assault Badge for close combat, not for any single action, but for accumulation of combat service. That's how it usually worked with these medals. And it was here that he first encountered something that would become increasingly common on the Eastern Front: Soviet raiding parties trying to capture German weapons, specifically those MG-42 machine guns that had proven so devastatingly effective. The Germans conducted their own raids too, ranging from 12-man squads up to rare 100-man units. Reconnaissance missions, prisoner captures for intelligence. The observer remained in constant readiness to call in fire support if these teams encountered trouble. Most of the time they didn't need it, but those howitzers helped rescue the situation 2 or 3 times. This 2-month deployment at Oranienbaum, it gave the division time to recuperate, to receive replacements. You have to understand, the 3.5 months of uninterrupted combat at the Volkhov, that was unusual. Normally, troops in intensive combat got rest after 3 or 4 weeks of heavy fighting. On a relatively inactive front like Oranienbaum, troops spent maybe 80 or 90% of their time at the front, despite rare rotations to the rear. Sometimes they had time to play cards, write letters. The heavy weapons company was relatively better off than regular infantry companies when it came to time on the front lines versus time in the rear. On August 1st, the observer was promoted to corporal. A week later, he received the Winter Medal, what the soldiers called the Frozen Meat Medal, for surviving the bitter cold that had killed so many. More importantly, he was finally granted a 3-week leave, his first since November 1940, almost 2 years since he'd seen his family, since he'd seen Anneliese, the woman he loved. The journey from Oranienbaum to Germany, about 1,000 miles. When they reached the border at Tilsit in East Prussia, everyone on the train underwent thorough delousing. All clothes and belongings treated with steam in a large chamber, long showers and hot water. Only after being declared free of all pests could they proceed into Germany. The sense of relief at getting out of Russia, the observer said it was overwhelming. 3 days after departing Oranienbaum, he arrived in Pogum, his home village. His family's welcome was even warmer than when he'd returned from Belgium. His sisters had grown so much in 20 months that they were almost unrecognizable, especially his 5-year-old sister Margaret. Playing with her was one of the highlights of his time home. His mother treated him like a conquering hero, even laid out specially prepared foods for him in a separate dining room, which the rest of the family envied. His sisters sang a plaintive song outside the door. "Here are quiet, call for pastries for Hall." But something was different this time. Despite the warm welcome, despite the familiar routines, settling into pleasant patterns of life proved impossible. When a soldier came home from the war in Russia, he was a different person. The psychological strain of living in constant danger, it lingered inside him. Old familiar farm labor proved more therapeutic than efforts to relax, but even that couldn't completely melt away the stress. And maybe, just maybe, the fighting and killing had affected something deeper, something in his soul that no amount of time would heal. Much had changed in Pogum by this time. The German government had begun sending prisoners of war and conscripted civilians to work as laborers in factories and on farms, replacing manpower serving at the front. Polish POWs had arrived after Poland's defeat in 1939, joined by French and Belgian POWs the next year. The observer's father, now a member of the Volkssturm Home Guard, had been ordered to serve as a guard for the village's 20 or so POWs. This duty required him to spend nights at the pub down the street, where prisoners were locked up in the ballroom. The family had been provided with a Polish POW named Zygmunt, a factory worker from the city of Lodz. They treated him as they would any German farmhand, worked beside him in the fields, never had any problems. Ignoring government regulations that POWs should eat separately from German families, the observer's mother regularly set a place for Zygmunt at their dining room table. Eventually, authorities permitted POWs to live on the farms if there was space where they could be safely confined. The family gave Zygmunt a room in the Altenteil, the grandparents' former home. In the middle of his 2-week visit with family, the observer departed on August 21st to see Anneliese in Hamburg. 2 years since they'd spent any significant time together, but their increasingly frequent exchange of letters had brought them closer. She was still engaged to someone else, the florist's son, but that was about to change. Arriving in Hamburg, he met her near the arcade across from City Hall, where she'd been working since leaving her position at the shop in the city's main train station. In the half-day that followed, they quickly recaptured the intimacy of their early relationship. Talking, strolling around the city, it was everything he'd imagined while frozen in the snow at Uretsk, while mired in the mud at the Volkhov. From the moment he saw Anneliese again, he began thinking seriously for the first time that she would make a wonderful wife, even if she was engaged to someone else. He couldn't conceal his sentiments. He told her directly, "I'm sorry, I do not want to interfere, but I still love you." What she chose to do was her decision, but it was important that she understood his feelings. Just before he boarded the train to return to Pogum for the remaining week of his leave, Anneliese handed him a gold cloverleaf talisman. She promised it would bring him good luck. He placed the gift in the breast pocket of his tunic, feeling confident it was only a matter of time before they would get back together. But both of them recognized something else. A soldier's fate on the battlefield was very uncertain. Despite widespread optimism over German advances toward the Volga and the Caucasus that summer, it was clear that many soldiers would not be coming home to their loved ones. By the time he returned from his 3-week furlough at the beginning of September, part of the 58th Division had been transferred about 70 miles south of Leningrad to a position on the north shore of Lake Ilmen, only about 15 or 20 miles south of the Volkhov battlefield. When he reached his company, it had taken up quarters in deserted Russian homes on the southern outskirts of Novgorod, an ancient Russian city. Their mission was relatively easy, guarding the far northern coast of Lake Ilmen against potential amphibious operations from the Soviet-held eastern shore. Even if the Russians managed to surprise amphibious landing, the natural defensive advantages of the position made them confident they could push the enemy back into the water before they established a secure foothold. This assignment to a quiet sector permitted more time to relax. While the weather remained warm, some of them laid beside the shore of Lake Ilmen. It almost felt like an extension of his leave, sitting in the sun, reading letters from home. Within weeks of his visit to Hamburg, he received the news he'd been hoping for. Anneliese had decided to break off her engagement and build a relationship with him. Ironically, having just won back her heart, he proceeded to lose the gold cloverleaf charm she'd given him for luck. Novgorod was just a 15-minute walk from their position, but he only ventured into the city once to wander its deserted streets. Like most Soviet communities, it was mainly filled with small wooden shacks and plain concrete buildings. Only the large bronze sculptures in the central plaza near the town's city hall made a favorable impression. His visit to one of the city's onion-domed churches presented a mixed picture. While the exterior remained relatively intact, the dilapidated interior had been used to store grain or beets. This sacrilegious vandalism reinforced his view of the communists as barbaric atheists who posed a grave danger to Europe's Christian civilization. Other soldiers took advantage of their location on the lake to go fishing. Not with rods or nets, though. They'd toss standard kilo-sized blocks of explosives into the water, causing stunned or dead fish to rise to the surface for easy retrieval. In a tragic incident, 4 soldiers fishing this way were killed when they accidentally blew up their own boat. Even during the quietest moments in Russia, death never seemed far away. At the end of November 1942, the 58th Infantry Division joined other German divisions transferring south of Lake Ilmen to help protect a vital but vulnerable supply corridor to something called the Demyansk Pocket. In late April, the Wehrmacht had counterattacked and forced through an overland route to isolated troops, but the roughly 4-mile wide and 7.5-mile long corridor remained precarious. With another Russian winter upon them, the division moved into an area just above the Pola River along the north side of a region in the hilly terrain known as the Valdai Heights. The fighting at Demyansk remained fairly constant, though in their area it lacked the intensity of what they had endured at the Volkhov. They sometimes yielded or seized ground in tactical retreats or advances, but the front lines remained relatively stable. Reaching their newly assigned post on a low ridge along this corridor, the observer and his communications specialist joined other soldiers in a large bunker near the front that served as living quarters. Because it was impossible to dig out an underground bunker in the frozen rock-hard earth, it had been constructed above ground, with snow camouflaging the log walls. A snow wall facing the Russian lines offered additional protection. Nearby, there was also a small observation tower. Despite their efforts to create a secure position, they soon began to be plagued by sniper fire from a Soviet sharpshooter. Fearful of getting hit, they were forced to remain inside the confined space of the bunker during daylight hours. After this situation had persisted for several days, the observer finally grew frustrated and decided to do something about it. Grabbing a Mauser rifle, he made his way from the bunker to the snow rampart. Crouching on his knees, he carved out a small aperture through the wall with his hands, scrutinizing the winter landscape. There was nothing that gave away the location of the enemy sharpshooter. Then, suddenly, a shot burst through the snow wall, passing just over the top of his helmet. He pulled his rifle from the hole and quickly ducked back into the bunker. As far as he was concerned, they would have to learn to live with the threat of the sniper. Soon afterward, he was surveying the enemy lines from the observation tower when he observed a Russian soldier walking out in the open through the snow about 500 yards away. As he shouted down a fire mission, an infantryman aimed a small 50mm mortar and dropped around into the tube. When the shell impacted about 50 feet from the Russian, the soldier appeared startled. Suddenly realizing his perilous situation, he took off running through the deep snow and never stopped. Despite the gauntlet of fire created by half a dozen mortar rounds falling around him, he somehow escaped unharmed. Sometimes war seemed more like a harmless game rather than the deadly struggle it really was. His turn as the quarry would come a few weeks later at another front-line bunker, perhaps a mile from their previous position. The morning after his arrival, he awoke to discover an overnight snowfall had built upon previous accumulations, leaving a powdery cushion a foot deep. Leaving the bunker with a field telephone, he trudged a short distance through the picturesque winter landscape until he reached a good observation point. Concealed by his white camouflage, he remained standing to better survey the surrounding terrain. A quick scan of the enemy position immediately revealed a couple of Red Army bunkers protruding 6 feet above ground. Fresh snow now partially covered the layer of protective earth piled onto the bunkers, but they appeared to be of recent construction and clearly posed a direct challenge to German control of the area. Selecting the closer and larger of the two, he called back firing coordinates to one of their 150mm howitzers, requesting a single round on the roughly 30-square-foot target. In a couple of minutes, an explosion threw up a cloud of snow about 20 yards to the left of the bunker. After adjusting the distance and direction, the second round landed 10 yards to the right. Advancing a little closer to better observe the target, he made a further correction and requested a delayed fuse. This round found its mark. Just after it smashed through the roof of the bunker, there was a loud whoosh of air as the shell detonated inside the structure. A second later, the only thing observable externally was a little white smoke that drifted out through the roof. Before he could call back targeting coordinates for the second bunker, enemy mortar rounds suddenly began bursting in the snow around him. Despite his camouflage, a Soviet observer had somehow spotted him during the 20 minutes that had passed. Now he was the prey. Moving clumsily through the snow, he headed for cover in the bunker a dozen yards away. Just over halfway to the entrance, a shell exploded right behind him. He felt a rush of air, but the deep snow partially absorbed the force of the blast, probably sparing him from serious injury. Gaining the relative safety of the bunker, he asked an infantry soldier inside whether he'd been hit. Examining the back of his padded jacket, the soldier confirmed it was perforated with tiny holes caused by metal splinters from the mortar round. During the next half hour, he painstakingly removed the small shrapnel fragments from the observer's skin. Once again, he'd been lucky to avoid more serious injury. The precision involved in targeting enemy bunkers was a great challenge, and it had become his favorite task as forward observer. His success in knocking out perhaps half a dozen of these structures over the previous year had earned him a reputation as a bunker-busting specialist inside the 13th Company. The destruction of the large bunker on the Demyansk corridor, however, had drawn him unwanted attention from the enemy. Around this time, the Red Army had begun deploying loudspeakers on the front lines to spout propaganda and threats delivered in perfect German. Perhaps a week after his successful elimination of the bunker, a soldier from one of the regular infantry companies asked him if he'd heard the Russians calling his name over the loudspeakers. He replied that he hadn't. The soldier informed him that these broadcasts were threatening him personally, announcing, "Lubeck, when we catch you, we will cut off your nuts." Apparently, a captured German soldier had identified his role in destroying their bunker. From experience, he regarded this warning very seriously. In at least one recent instance, the Russians had castrated a sergeant and a corporal captured from one of the regiment's infantry companies. They discovered them the next day, dead from loss of blood. Such brutality reinforced their determination to avoid being taken prisoner by the Red Army at all costs, even if they had to take their own lives to escape that fate. This mentality was totally different than the mindset they possessed during the French campaign. If surrounded by French troops, he would have surrendered, with confidence that he'd be treated humanely. But Russia was different. Everything about Russia was different. Realizing that the isolated position at Demyansk was a strategic liability, the Army High Command began withdrawing equipment in early February 1943. On February 17th, it officially ordered the evacuation of the pocket to begin. Though under intense pressure from Soviet forces, the German army conducted an orderly retreat. The 58th Infantry Division pulled out of the area on February 24th. At the beginning of March 1943, the division returned to the north coast of Lake Ilmen to occupy a new defensive position near Novgorod, not far from where they'd served the previous fall. Their mission was once again guarding against potential amphibious operations, but now the thick winter ice covering Lake Ilmen provided a hard crust across which Russian forces could carry out land operations. In the weeks that followed, the Red Army's attacks across the frozen lake proved disastrous failures. The ability to spot their approach across the flat surface at a great distance, even under cover of darkness, gave the Germans a significant advantage. When the Soviets made their attempts, the heavier artillery pounded them so effectively that they generally never even came within range of the company's guns, located a couple of miles from the shoreline. As artillery shells shattered the lake's ice shell, men and equipment would slide into the freezing waters below. In a battalion-sized attack against the regiment positioned next to them, the Red Army employed a number of large motorized sleds, apparently intending to cross the frozen lake before German forces could react. This particular assault did succeed in reaching German lines, but the enemy was soon repulsed with heavy casualties. The relative security of their position at Novgorod allowed them a little time to relax. Among the German troops, perhaps the most readily embraced feature of Russian culture was the banya, the bathhouse. Typically built about 50 yards behind a Russian home, soldiers would steam themselves inside before exiting to cool themselves in the snow. On one of these occasions, someone started a snowball fight. Still naked, they engaged in a running battle in the frozen winter landscape, momentarily forgetting the real war. Despite the Wehrmacht's successful evacuation of the Demyansk Pocket to more defensible positions and small tactical victories like those at Novgorod, morale slowly began to decline in 1943. For Army Group North, the war had definitively shifted to a defensive struggle to hold the gains achieved in 1941. While the Soviets now held the military initiative, German troops were also aware of the catastrophic fate of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, far to the south. After being encircled by the Red Army in November 1942, its survivors were finally forced to surrender in February. So great was the magnitude of the calamity that even Goebbels' propaganda ministry didn't attempt to conceal it. While the war in Russia took a mounting toll of casualties among German troops, families back home began to increasingly suffer from Anglo-American bombing raids. Yet after 2 years of war, German forces remained deep inside enemy territory and maintained faith in Germany's ultimate triumph. Experience at the front left them wholly convinced that the army was still superior in terms of both troops and equipment. Generals and other officers retained their full confidence and gave them a tactical advantage on the battlefield. They believed that German industry would continue to supply them with qualitatively better weapons than those of the enemy. Even after Stalingrad, they believed they could still win a defensive struggle. By not losing, the Red Army would gradually exhaust itself in bloody assaults that produced only minor gains or no advantage at all. It seemed that the Soviet Union would eventually have to accept a negotiated peace that would leave Germany with much of its territorial gains. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see from their foxholes and bunkers, was how political interference at the highest levels was undermining their tactical successes. Only after the war would it become clear that Hitler had engaged in a constant struggle against the Wehrmacht's general staff for control of military decision-making. As the war progressed, he increasingly subordinated the generals and the army to his whims. Unaware of Hitler's bungling and the political conflicts at the top, they never questioned military decision-making until late in the war. Witnessing skilled leadership exercised in the field, German troops at the front held the officer corps in high esteem. Yet even if tactical decisions by field officers remained unaffected, political meddling at higher levels produced many poor strategic decisions. In the Red Army, the intervention of communist political leadership in military operations was even more pervasive. Unlike the Wehrmacht, the Red Army installed polytruks, political officers, down to the company level and empowered them to make final decisions on lower-level tactical matters about how and where to fight. Although the Russians possessed many capable military officers well-versed in military tactics, the presence of these polytruks limited their effectiveness on the battlefield. This political interference largely explains Germany's tactical superiority. As polytruks gained more influence over military decisions later in the war, they caused the Red Army unnecessary casualties. Based on the observer's experience in combat and intelligence obtained from captured enemy troops, he would later judge that perhaps a quarter of Red Army casualties could be blamed on the interference of polytruks. It was also apparent to German troops at the front that Soviet political leaders and officers regarded an ordinary soldier's life as a commodity without much value. They never hesitated to expend the lives of their men in operations that had minimal chance of success. The Red Army sometimes, possibly most of the time, fortified its troops with vodka to instill confidence in soldiers who often faced daunting odds. As witnessed at the Volkhov, there were instances where a portion of Red Army troops in an attack would even begin moving forward unarmed, with orders to retrieve weapons from those who were killed in the advance. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, would set up machine guns behind the attacking infantry to prevent any retreat. With no alternative, these troops would advance against well-defended positions to be slaughtered or captured. If captured, the Russian soldier would generally continue to resist. Attempts to threaten a prisoner with a firearm during interrogations would frequently produce only a smile. Strangely, only the threat of a beating with a club or similar weapon would tend to make the man fearful. In addition to ethnically Slavic troops, growing numbers of Mongolians from the eastern parts of the Soviet Union began to appear in Red Army units after 1943. While not afraid of the typical Slav, German troops feared these Mongolians, who were especially tough and brutal adversaries in combat. At the start of the war, German soldiers often viewed and treated the Soviet soldier as a primitive brute. As they came to know the enemy, however, the natural courage and toughness of the Red Army soldier won their respect. Whatever their views on communism, it soon became clear that Russian troops were willing to sacrifice their lives to repel the German invaders who had occupied their motherland. In late March, as the Red Army began its second major offensive in the Leningrad sector, the 58th Infantry Division was pulled from Novgorod and traveled some 60 miles north to help bolster threatened sectors. When the division reached the front line near the town of Krasny, just south of the Neva River, they were placed in a reserve position behind the Spanish Blue Division, which was fighting in Russia as a German ally. By this time, the 13th Company had gone through further changes in leadership. The observer had been designated to serve as informal liaison between the Heavy Weapons Company and the Spanish forces stationed in front of them. Beyond coordinating the use of heavy guns to support the Spanish in case of Soviet attack, he dealt with any other issues that might arise between the company and their division. There was generally good relationship between German and Spanish troops, but uncertainty about the Spanish soldiers' capability on the battlefield. Heavy losses in preceding months of combat in this sector reduced confidence in their ability to resist a serious Red Army attack. When Soviet artillery fire began to pound Spanish positions a couple of days later, the company immediately went to their support with howitzers and recently issued 105mm mortars. Despite best efforts, the Russian assault sent a portion of Spanish troops reeling backward. In response to the crisis, seasoned German infantry quickly moved forward and counterattacked to prevent the initial enemy penetration from developing into a full-scale breakthrough. Within a couple of hours, German troops had forced the Red Army to retreat and stabilized the front lines. In the weeks of relative quiet that followed, they were permitted much-needed rest behind the front. A group from the company were temporarily quartered in a surviving Russian home, and for the first time in over a year, the observer encountered Russian women, two in their 30s or 40s, and their children. They shared the small house with these residents, who appeared almost apathetic about German presence. During this period of relative quiet, a number of soldiers made use of a nearby Russian banya to relax. This led to unexpected tragedy when soldiers from the Spanish Blue Division decided to engage in target practice with a machine gun in the same location. Opening fire, they accidentally killed all 4 Germans who had been relaxing inside the bathhouse. Although this incident naturally caused some bitterness toward the Spanish, most German soldiers had grown so accustomed to death that they were almost desensitized. 3.5 weeks after their arrival at Krasny, the observer received his second furlough from duty in Russia and departed on April 24th for the long trip home to Germany. Despite the warm welcome he received from his family, coming home from the fighting in Russia remained a difficult experience. Over the first week or so, he couldn't connect to civilian life at all. During the day, his mind was still at the front as if he'd never left. His nights were filled with dreams of combat. Only a couple of weeks into his leave did he slowly begin to readjust, but by then, of course, he had to return to the front. On May 8th, Anneliese came to Pugum for her first visit with his family since breaking off her engagement. Their relationship had continued to grow more intimate. On walks around the farm, they talked about their future plans. Though marriage was still not imminent, it was already apparent to his family that eventually they would wed. Everyone thought very highly of Anneliese. His sisters treated her like a sister. His mother adored her. Only his father expressed any concern. He liked Anneliese personally, but had been trying to convince his son that a man with his prospects could make a better marital connection by pursuing a woman from a wealthier background. His concern reflected their own family's monetary difficulties during the Great Depression. But the observer didn't agree with regarding marriage from a purely material point of view. Upset that his father was attempting to meddle in what was a highly personal matter, he told him bluntly, "Dad, this is my decision. I love this woman and I'm going to marry her. You are not going to interfere." His father never again questioned his judgment. At this time, Anneliese was still working at the flower shop across from Hamburg City Hall. However, the previous January she'd volunteered to enter training as a Red Cross nurse, feeling she had a patriotic duty to make a more direct contribution to the war effort. Shortly after her visit, she would start a 3-month training course at a hospital in Hamburg. As Anneliese headed back home and the observer set out on the journey back to the front on May 12th, they parted knowing that it was not only him who would soon be at risk. If readjustment to life at home was difficult, the separation from loved ones to return to the front was infinitely worse. As his train traveled down the miles of track, it was impossible not to dwell on memories of Anneliese in his arms and time spent with his family, uncertain if he would live to see them again. Those first mid-May days back at the front at Krasny were among the worst he experienced as a soldier. Normally, the familiar pattern of trench warfare would again become his daily reality after about a week or so back at the front. But on this occasion, his efforts to leave home behind failed. When a soldier's mind is focused on thoughts of home, he can become careless and highly vulnerable to injury or death. In an effort to compensate for his distraction, he sought to exercise an especially high level of caution during this period. The lines at Krasny shifted little, but the company fought in a number of small and large actions against enemy forces during this period. The Russians would sometimes stage attacks that seemed designed to acquire German food supplies as much as to occupy positions. When Soviet troops broke into German trenches, they would often fall back a couple hundred yards, while the Russians went into bunkers to pillage food stocks. With time to regroup, they would organize a counterattack that threw them back out, almost as if they were operating on a tacitly agreed schedule. On Sunday, June 17th, the observer turned 23. Birthdays at the front received little recognition, but on this occasion, Second Lieutenant Reichardt, the company commander, took note and presented him with a bottle of cognac. He also used the rare calm at the front to hold their first church service since the start of the war in Russia almost 2 years earlier. Such respites from the conflict never lasted long. Sometimes the war would strike unexpectedly. As he was walking among some large trees behind the lines on a quiet day, he heard the distant boom of an enemy artillery piece. Keeping his ears tuned to the whistle of the incoming round, he suddenly realized it was coming close, very close. Instantly flinging himself flat, he pressed his body down into the rain-soaked earth. In that brief moment while he awaited its impact, life or death seemed equally possible. His ears hadn't deceived him. The shell landed only 3 or 4 feet away from his prone body, but fortunately plunged deep into the mud before detonating. Incredibly, the explosion left him covered with muck, but otherwise unhurt. Even when they slept, combat often filled their dreams. One night, the observer came partially awake in the bunker, mistakenly believing in his still semi-conscious state that they were under enemy attack. Snatching a hand grenade, he yelled, "The Russians are coming!" Fortunately for him, his communications specialist was fully alert and managed to yank the grenade from his hand before the pin was removed. Because they were down in a bunker, there was no way he could have gotten rid of it in time. In that confined space, the blast would have killed them both. Even though his assistant was his subordinate, rank mattered little in such a situation. At that moment, he was simply a comrade who was looking out for him, just as he would look out for his comrade. As the weeks at the front passed, his time at home came to seem like a far-off dream, though Anneliese remained constantly in his thoughts. For her 22nd birthday on June 29th, he arranged to have a dozen red roses sent to her. It was as much an expression of his hope for their future together as it was a token of his deep affection. While his correspondence to her was mostly devoted to expressing his feelings, he would sometimes make passing mention of combat operations in terms that would pass censorship. In a letter on June 20th, he referenced a duel between their howitzers and Soviet artillery. Writing on July 10th, he noted that their howitzers and mortars had successfully repulsed an assault by the Russians against their position. These engagements were routine and otherwise soon forgotten. On July 22nd, the Red Army initiated the Third Battle of Ladoga, renewing its struggle to break the German siege lines east of Leningrad in the area close to the lake. 2 days later, the division was rushed 15 miles from the Krasny sector to a key position beside the Neva River in an area known as the Sinyavino Heights. This placed them about 4 miles southeast of Lake Ladoga and 3 miles northwest of the critical rail junction of Emga. The 58th Division soon experienced some of its heaviest fighting of the war as the Soviet 67th Army attempted to seize the high ground from them. The struggle on August 4th was particularly brutal. The 154th Regiment's attempt to regain ground it had lost had to be broken off after the counterattack met with stiff enemy resistance and heavy losses. On August 8th, they experienced more tough fighting that tied the observer down in a foxhole for hours. On a generally quiet day a short time later, a strange episode occurred as he was tramping along a dirt road on the way from his frontline position to his rear bunker, about a mile behind the front. As he approached the area just behind their howitzers, a young German second lieutenant wearing an unsoiled uniform came strolling up the road toward him from the north. This immediately struck him as odd, since the German army had no units located in that direction. While he was baffled by the officer's presence in the area, the lieutenant didn't appear nervous or exhibit any suspicious behavior. As they passed one another, he cordially returned the observer's salute, and the observer dismissed his apprehensions. 2 hours later, Soviet heavy artillery slammed 50 or 60 shells into their position with pinpoint accuracy. Only their deeply dug entrenchments prevented the bombardment from causing any casualties or damage to the howitzers. Instantly, his mind flashed back to the mysterious German officer. In retrospect, he concluded that the man must indeed have been a Russian agent gathering intelligence. His close-up scouting of their position would explain the enemy's ability to target their camouflaged positions so precisely. Convinced of his failure to identify a spy, he silently vowed to be far more wary of anything unusual in the future. On an afternoon a few days later, he headed up to the front line to join his close comrade, Sergeant Schulter, who had begun interchanging with him as the company's forward observer. Becoming suspicious about the unusual quiet that followed the recent artillery attack, Schulter warned him that the Red Army might be preparing another assault. Deciding to study the enemy position himself, the observer climbed up the branches of a pine tree at the edge of the forest, about 100 yards behind their trenches. In case any targets appeared, he hauled along a field telephone. Perhaps half an hour after he reached his perch about 20 feet up, 4 Soviet T-34 tanks suddenly appeared from the northeast and began a slow advance across the flat ground directly toward his location in the tree. Soldiers were riding on top of the tanks, which were followed by a large number of additional infantry on foot. While the company's heavy guns were not designed to serve in an anti-tank role and lacked armor-piercing rounds, he knew from long experience that it was possible to accurately target the fire of the guns into an area about 10 square yards in size. With a chance to halt the advance before it progressed any further toward their regiment's position, he used the field telephone to direct one of the 150mm guns to fire a round against the closest T-34, about 500 yards to his front. Falling just to the left of the target, the first shell's blast knocked the enemy troops from the tank but failed to damage the vehicle. After redirecting the howitzer to shift its fire to the right, the next round fell short of the tank. The third shell landed very close, missing the T-34 by only a few feet. Receiving a further correction, the gun crew fired a fourth round. When the shell detonated against the turret, the tank instantly ground to a halt. Seconds later, a small plume of white smoke began to drift from the vehicle. Shifting his attention to a second T-34, about 20 yards behind the destroyed one, he called in a fifth round. Smashing into its treads from the side, the shell's explosion immobilized the vehicle, forcing its crew to jump out and run for cover. The third Soviet tank in the group immediately ceased its advance, while the fourth one began to retreat. As this assault ended, a larger group of around 15 tanks momentarily came into view 1,000 yards behind the scene of the attack before moving out of sight behind a hill. Unsure whether this larger armored force would renew the advance, he telephoned back to headquarters to make the new regimental commander, Colonel Hermann Henrik Behrens, aware of the situation. "Where are you?" the colonel demanded before he could even speak. "I am in a tree right behind the front line," he responded with some trepidation. "What the hell are you doing up there?" the colonel yelled back, obviously concerned that he would place himself in such a vulnerable position. Informing him that they had stopped an armored attack probing their defenses, the observer warned that significant tank forces were massing behind it and might conduct another assault. After requesting details on the number of tanks and their location, the colonel indicated he would pass along the intelligence to divisional headquarters and then hung up. Once their initial thrust had been halted, the Soviets did not attempt to renew their attack on that sector of the front. Despite his thrill at knocking out the tanks, there was still danger that the enemy would spot him. The longer he remained in his exposed position, climbing down the tree in daylight would greatly increase the risk of attracting the attention of a Russian sniper or machine gun crew. In this dilemma, his only choice was to wait for the cover of darkness. When dusk finally fell about an hour later, he made a rapid slide down the trump and headed for safety in the rear. Reaching the gun crew, he passed along news of their small triumph. In a war filled with many combat engagements, hitting a moving target with indirect fire from guns in the rear was a rare and memorable accomplishment. Over the course of the war, most casualties in the 13th Company resulted from Russian artillery and mortars, to a lesser extent from small arms fire. About this time, however, they also began to endure their first bombing and strafing raids by Soviet aircraft. During the daytime, they occasionally faced a threat from Soviet ground attack planes like the Ilyushin II Sturmovik. At night, they confronted the menace of the Polikarpov I-2, nicknamed the Na-Machiner. the sewing machine, for the loud rhythmic clattering of its engine. The noisy approach of the sewing machine was audible at a great distance, but it was virtually impossible to target them in the darkness. Flying a couple hundred feet overhead, the pilot and co-pilot would search for any flicker of light that would reveal the location of German lines or rear camps. Despite efforts to black out everything on the ground, there was bound to be someone who would light a cigarette or use a flashlight that the enemy could spot. Once locating a potential target, the Soviet pilots often cut their engines to glide silently over the spot before dropping their bombs on unsuspecting targets below. The day after one of these nocturnal raids by a sewing machine, not long after the tank battle, the observer was again up front operating as forward observer. Immediately after directing one of the 150mm howitzers to fire a round against an enemy target, he instead heard an enormous boom from the direction of their heavy guns in the rear. The mystery was soon revealed. A misfiring shell inside the barrel of the howitzer had caused an explosion that detonated the shells stacked next to it, killing the 5-man gun crew and obliterating everything in the vicinity. Though unable to get back and observe the scene himself, he was told that only a large crater remained. This malfunction could have resulted from faulty workmanship or sabotage in the manufacture of the shell, but he was convinced it resulted from the phosphorus dropped on their position during the previous night's air raid. A corrosive particle of phosphorus could have burned a small hole in a shell that went undetected during its loading. Unfortunately, a sudden change in the battlefield situation within hours of this accident forced the company to pull back from the position without conducting an adequate investigation. Earlier combat in the area of the Leningrad siege had primarily involved stationary trench warfare, similar to that experienced on the Western Front in the First World War. In contrast, the combat near the Neva was more fluid and more bloody. Frequently, there were sudden shifts in the front lines as both sides in turn retreated and counterattacked. As always, the 13th Company experienced a much lower casualty rate than the 154th Regiment's regular infantry companies, since the majority of their personnel served in the rear handling heavy weapons. Even though his assignment as forward observer placed him on the front line, his freedom to avoid or pull out of more hazardous areas gave him a significant advantage over the regular infantry. Back in Germany, where Annalisa was completing her nursing training, she and other civilians had begun to experience firsthand the horror of war. Frequent Allied air raids by large bomber formations now often forced her and other members of her household to take refuge in the basement of her father's home in Hamburg. At the end of July 1943, he heard on the radio that the Allies were repeatedly targeting Hamburg with powerful airstrikes, employing hundreds of planes. In the first of a series of massive area bombings of German cities, the enemy dropped large numbers of incendiary bombs that ignited multiple blazes. Heat and strong winds soon whipped these into a firestorm of unprecedented scale that killed about 40,000 people and devastated much of the central part of the city. In the aftermath of the attack, all mail to Hamburg stopped for a couple of weeks, leaving him deeply concerned. About 3 weeks later, he received word that Anneliese and her family had survived. By the time her letter reached him, Anneliese had meanwhile completed her basic nursing training and been transferred up to a hospital at St. Peter-Ording on the North Sea coast, a location where she would be much safer. Composing a letter to Anneliese, he conveyed both their difficult conditions at the front as well as his concerns for her. "We are in the most northern part of the Eastern Front, on a large river, the Neva. We are in foxholes, and life is really miserable. We don't get any sleep. I await a letter from you concerning the bombing of Hamburg on 25th and 26th of July, 1943. It would be months later before he learned what she had personally experienced. Despite the hardships in Russia, he still expressed an abiding optimism about the outcome of the conflict. We don't have very much of our younger years left to us, but this will change when the war is finished. We here on the front are very positive that we will win the war." His words also sought to reassure her by painting a brighter future for them after the fighting had ended. All that we are going through now will be compensated by our mutual love. After our victory, we will make up for all these missing moments and hours." On September 4th, 1943, the division was finally pulled out of the Sinyavino Heights after enduring some of the most intense combat of the war. They had held their ground, but at tremendous cost. The observer had survived once again, but how many more times could his luck hold? As they moved to a quieter sector for rest and replenishment, he couldn't help but notice the changes in the men around him. The bright optimism of 1941 had faded. The easy victories of the early war seemed like ancient history now. They were no longer advancing, they were holding. And everyone knew that an army that only holds is an army that's slowly losing. Still, they remained soldiers. They had their duty, their comrades, and for him, the thought of Anneliese waiting back home. That was enough to keep going, enough to face another day, another battle, another chance that a sniper's bullet or artillery shell would find him instead of the man next to him. The war in the East had become a grinding struggle of attrition, and the observer, like millions of others on both sides, was caught in its relentless machinery. But his story, his experience, gives us a window into what that struggle really meant, not in terms of grand strategy or political ideology, but in terms of individual human beings trying to survive in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. So there you have it, a detailed account of one soldier's experience on the Eastern Front during World War II, drawn from historical records and personal testimony. Not glorified, not sanitized, but presented as the complex, difficult reality it was. These are the stories that need to be told, the experiences that need to be remembered, because they remind us of the true cost of war. If you found this video valuable, if you believe these historical testimonies need to be preserved and shared, then I'd appreciate you checking out our previous documentary. Click the video that just appeared on your screen, and I'll see you there.